OCM, OCMCIet, OCMCIet, Ait Nisqualowans Equitsnala. Mi sep kakwitlam atana humath koimach tmo is kohomish eats awelatuth. Antha Rhiannon Bennett Tlitsna humathquiam. My dear friends and relatives, it gives me such good feelings to see you all here today gathered and to welcome each and every one of you to the occupied and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Before we begin, just a note that the acoustics in this room are in such a way that the smallest of voices is going to carry. So a humble request to hold your chairs and to hold your voices and to hold this space as it's taking a lot of courage and a lot of effort and a lot of labor for these speakers to come to the mic and to share their words with you today. So I ask humbly and respectfully that you honor and respect the people being so brave to come to this mic and to speak today, and that we hold those sacred words and we go forward and we share them. So before I call up the first speaker, I just wanted to really ground us on the land that we're on today, onto these occupied territories. And to really think about what it is that we're here to talk about today. So as many of you probably know, on Friday, this report was already leaked through the media. And I just want to share some words on that, on how incredibly disrespectful that was, and what a continued violation of Indigenous women that was. How Indigenous women and families were denied that opportunity to come together today in a safe space and to have these conversations. That was taken from us again, that safety. That perpetual violence against Indigenous women is even showing itself through the leaked report, a report that's supposed to talk about the problems that Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people are facing, and just how shameful that is, and how Canadian that is to not think about the human aspect and the human consequences of that leak. So it is a very heavy day today, but it's also a day to walk forward, and we have a lot of work to do. Because I'm sure, as many of you have seen over the weekend, there's still this great denial about the pain and suffering and the violence and the genocide that Indigenous people endure. And that the call to action to each of you, my personal call to action to you, is to stand up and to challenge those deniers of that genocide. We have a lot of work to do. But I'm inspired by the people on the stage behind me and by each of you here today. So on that note, I'm going to call forward our first speaker this morning, Lorelei Williams, family member and founder of Butterflies in Spirit.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to acknowledge, thank you, the Coast Salish people whose territory we're on, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. My name is Lorelei Williams, and I am from Shkatin Nations on my mom's side and Sta'alis on my dad's side. I do a lot of work around the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls because I have a missing aunt, Belinda Williams, who has been missing since 1978. My cousin Tanya Holick went missing in 1996. Her DNA was later found on Robert Picton's farm. Today is an emotional day for me it's the end of the national inquiry. So many of us family members fought for this national inquiry. And some of it was good, some of it was bad. Some families couldn't even testify. It was just too hard. It was too hard for me as well, and I have done a lot of work on myself with my traumas. Self-care, I did everything I could, and I found myself in my bed, not being able to get out of bed the day that I had to testify. I really couldn't get out of bed. I contacted my supports, and they had to come and get me. I was crying so much when I got out of my bed because I was laying down. The tears matted my hair. So I feel for all the families today, all the families across this country, the ones who testified, the ones who didn't get to testify because it was too hard. I just want to say, I'm here for you if you need anything, because I know how this is. I know how it feels. Today is the last day of the national inquiry into MMIWG, and the final report was released in Gatineau, Quebec. I was given the opportunity to attend this inquiry. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs was actually willing to fly me out there. However, I thought it would be more important for me to stay here with Feminists Deliver because I felt it's more important to tell the world the issue of MMIWG here in Canada. The world needs to know that Canada is not perfect. A lot of people around the world think Canada's perfect. When I first heard about the Women Deliver conference, it sounded amazing. However, when I heard that Justin Trudeau was one of the speakers representing Canada, I became very upset because he doesn't represent our original nations of Turtle Island, also known as Canada. He doesn't represent the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. How could they have this person who said yes, okay, yes, he gave us this national inquiry into MMIWG. However, he approved the pipelines to go into Mother Earth, raping her, and creating more places for women to go missing and be murdered along these pipelines. It is a known fact that our Indigenous women and girls go missing and are murdered along these pipelines. Another part of this is the disrespect towards Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. Something that came out of the report is they're pointing out the Canadian genocide. This really stuck out to me as well. Canadians need to stop being racist and being in denial about the genocide against our people. We are the original nations of Turtle Island. We're dealing with a collective trauma here created by the Canadian government, police, and the priests and nuns who ran the residential school systems. They have been after the land, and what better way to do that than to target our Indigenous women and girls who are our life givers. Tamara Starblanket proves the genocide against our original nations legally in her book called Suffer the Little Children. If you want to know more about the genocide against our people, she proves it legally here in this book. All of the systems are against us to this day. The issue of MMIWG is a horrific issue. Our Indigenous women and girls are going missing and being murdered at a high rate, and it's not stopping. It's not only happening here, but in the States as well. I was sent this poster the other day. Wabinigisi Penny Robertson went missing May 24th. Her body was found on Saturday, June 1st. Her family found her. Her family searched for her. It wasn't the police, it was her family that searched for her, and they found her. This is horrible. The police didn't find her. Her family found her hanging, bound up. And I was given permission by the family to share this because no media is actually covering this down in the States. We need to come together to fight this issue because it's happening all over the world. Canada is a first world country. This shouldn't be happening here. We need to lead by example. This has got to stop. Thank you.
Yes, and also, if you could also please turn off your notifications, turn off the vibrating, turn off the ringing of your devices as well, please. Welcome to take your photos, send out your tweets, but please turn off the sounds and the vibrations as the speakers are speaking. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sophie Sophie Morosky, family member and key contributor on the Red Women Rising report on MMIWG.
Good morning. My name is Sophie Morosky, and I'm of the Denisoline and Cree Nations, Woodland Cree Nations of northern Manitoba, Treaty 10 area. I've lived in Vancouver for over 30 years, and I'm a family member. My sister Rose Merasty was killed in the downtown east side in 1991 in Blatt Alley. When this inquiry was launched, I had some doubts, and I was skeptical because I think that for centuries since first contact, the numbers of Indigenous women and girls are way, way larger than what's been reported. I believe that Indigenous women and girls have been murdered and raped and assaulted and taken since first contact. I want to talk a little bit about the review on the Gladue principle, because this is one of the recommendations that came up in the inquiry and that was submitted. The Gladue factor, the requirement is that the Gladue factors be used as mitigating factors only unless the victim is an Indigenous woman, in which case her wishes should take precedence over an offender. The government needs to review the use of this principle in cases involving the deaths of Indigenous women and girls. My sister Rose was killed by an Indigenous man, and because of this principle, he was released after serving only 1 month in the holding cell. After I made a testimony at the Richmond hearings, the police gave me a report and told me that he had reoffended and is now serving a life sentence. I have to agree with Senator Lillian Dick that implementing the 3 recommendations of the inquiry would be the opportunity to do the right thing. One which is a call for stiffer penalties for perpetrators of domestic violence, especially when the victim is an Indigenous woman, and automatic first-degree murder charges for homicide of Indigenous women. In the case of my sister and the person that this man hurt afterwards, it could have been prevented. My sister didn't have all the wraparound services that I know that a lot of Indigenous women don't have as well. There needs to be more Indigenous women services led by Indigenous women. All Indigenous women have a basic human right to clean water, food security, safe and affordable housing, culture, their children, and an end to child apprehension, transportation, and a guaranteed livable income. These calls to justice are not optional, and human rights are legal obligations that all levels of government must act on. Masicho.
Next, I'd like to call forward Summer Rain, Manager of Indigenous Women's Programming at the BWSS.
Good morning and welcome. I want to start with acknowledging that we are gathered here on the unceded, occupied Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and express my gratitude for being able to work and play on these sacred lands. I think it came as a surprise to many to read in the National Inquiry report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and gender non-binary individuals that the commissioners are referring to the state of crisis we are in regards to Indigenous women and girls as a genocide. This public outing of the fact that Indigenous people across Turtle Island are in fact targeted by the genocide comes as no surprise to Indigenous communities, as they have had to fight every day for hundreds of years to stay alive. We have to acknowledge that Canada is a colonial state and only exists because of their attempts to erode all Indigenous lands, peoples, and communities. Canada was formed in an act of genocide 150 years ago, and that act continues today. The fact that the report states that Canada is finally listening is appalling. Indigenous communities, leaders, and women have been raising their voices and taking to the lands for hundreds of years. Listening is not action. Listening does not stop men from being able to target and harm Indigenous women and girls, trans, and two-spirit with near impunity. That is evident in the fact that 200 women and girls have gone missing or have been murdered since the start of the National Inquiry. Listening does not end the horrific levels of gender-based race-fueled violence Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people face every day. Listening does not show that Indigenous women and girls are valuable, are sacred, and are not disposable. Listening does not show men who attack women and girls, fueled by race and gender discrimination, that they will be held accountable. What we need Canada to do is to immediately end the genocide of Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous women and girls who face a specific form of genocide. To eradicate all sex discrimination in the Indian Act and return the rightful lands, status, power, and positions to Indigenous women and girls. To eradicate all racist and gendered policy that dictates the child welfare system that targets Indigenous children, particularly Indigenous girls. To address the racism and patriarchy within the justice system, a system built by white men to protect white men, and to act on cases of gender-based violence and send a clear public message that Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people are sacred. To back and financially support Indigenous women's programs and anti-violence organizations with unrestricted core funding in all communities that does not peg Indigenous and anti-violence organizations against each other. These are just the first steps that Canada can take to show that Indigenous women and girls are valuable, are sacred. Haishko, Siam.
Next, it's my honor to introduce Anita Lucchesi, Skyan Scholar, Executive Director of the Sovereign Body Institute.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to say how thankful I am to the Coast Salish peoples who are hosting us on their territory here and allowing us to gather in this space to have some really hard conversations today about how to move forward to protect Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. I'm here as the Executive Director of Sovereign Bodies Institute, which is an Indigenous-run grassroots research institute dedicated to work on gender and sexual violence in Indigenous communities across the continent of North America. So we're based in the US, we have staff and board in Canada as well, and in January we started building relationships with folks in Latin America as well, because those are colonial borders that don't define who we are as Indigenous people or the work that we do. I'm also here as the descendant of a woman who was taken away from our people by a non-Native man and never returned home. I come from the Cheyenne people. We're a Plains people. Now our tribe is split in two in Montana and Oklahoma. I'm also here as a survivor who almost ended up missing or murdered myself, both due to domestic violence and trafficking. One of the stories about my experiences that I rarely share, and certainly never in a public space like this, but because of the intensity of the day, I feel obligated to do so or responsible to do so, is, my experience of trafficking is that I was sold into trafficking by my abuser. And my first experience with that was I was home alone, and a man came to the house with a chainsaw and said he had bought me, and that if I didn't go with him, he was going to cut me into pieces. I don't think you can imagine what that scenario feels like or looks like if you haven't been through it. But when I say that I was almost one of the women murdered, that's what I mean. I mean there was a man with a chainsaw at my front door dedicated to killing me if I didn't sleep with him and allow him to sell me. So with that in mind, I want to share a teaching that was shared with me by an elder that I work with, Anti-Faith Spotted Eagle, who's an Ahangtuan Dakota elder, and has done all sorts of amazing work for Indigenous women and girls in our communities, revitalization of our teen girls coming of age ceremonies, which is an important form of violence prevention. One of the things that she's shared with me about this movement and about MMIW is that
our sisters and our Two-Spirit relatives who have been missing or murdered, they paid with their lives for this movement. They gave their lives so that we would be able to fight for the safety of other Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks. They lost their lives in the struggle for us to live lives free from violence. And we have a responsibility to them. They are warriors for our people, and they still are. Their spirits are here with us. They're here in this room. They're here with us in all the work that we do, and we have a responsibility to them as relatives. And they have things they're trying to get done for our peoples. As you'll see in the report, when it comes to addressing violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, there's all sorts of intersecting issues, whether it's language or safety for our children or respect for our homelands. That tells you something. That tells you these spirits that are here guiding us and doing the work have a lot they're trying to get done for our peoples and our communities. And it's on us to be their helpers. Every single one of us in this room, every person watching, there's cameras in the back filming, every single one of us, it's on us to be a helper. So when you leave this space, think about what that means. I'd like to close by saying what an honor it is to be here as someone from a people occupied by the United States. So I've lived in Canada, I've worked in Canada, but I'm not Canadian. So to be here as a diplomat from my people and from the Indigenous MMIW movement in the United States really is an honor and a privilege. And what I'd like to share is Sovereign Bodies Institute grew out of the grassroots work that I was doing as a survivor and a community member to start an MMIW database that spans across colonial borders. So for the last 4 years, we've collected data on the US and Canada, and then as I mentioned in January, we expanded to Latin America. It's meant so much to me to be able to build sisterhood and kinship across the colonial border separating Indigenous communities in the US and Canada. And I do want to say that the genocide that's occurred here in Canada and continues to occur here is also something that we're experiencing in the United States. Sovereign Bodies Institute has actually documented over 2,000 MMIWG cases in the United States. This is not an issue unique to Canada. This is an issue unique to settler colonialism, wherever it occurs. And so with that in mind, I look forward to the path ahead with all of our relatives here on both sides of the border so that we can continue to build that kinship to strengthen the sovereignty and safety of our women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Naish.
And now it's my honor to introduce Sharon McIver Ilakatma from Lower Nicola Indian Band, activist, lawyer, and college professor.
I want to acknowledge the land that I'm standing on is the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm really happy to be here. I don't know, I've been doing this work for a very, very long time, and today having this report released, something that we've been fighting for well over 35 years, to have it released today, and it's actually a reality, is something that I didn't think I would live to see. So that I'm pleased about that. I wanted to talk about a few things out of the report. First and foremost, the use of the term genocide. It's finally good to have it acknowledged that what's been happening to us for the last 200 years is genocide. And genocide is specifically aimed at women. But for us, the next generation would not happen. So if you want to get rid of a people, you've got to get rid of their women. And how do you do that? The report has talked a lot about how that has happened. They've built, the government, Canadian government, has built a structure of laws, policies, and practices that treat Indigenous women as inferior or lesser human beings. And over that time, the result has been rates of violence, high rates of violence, exploitation, rapes, and disappearances and murders of Indigenous women and girls. The government has also been told over and over and over again, one of the root causes of the violence against Indigenous women and girls through these practices and policies is the discrimination embedded in the Indian Act legislation. And many of us over the years have challenged the government, and the government has been told by those bodies that we've gone to challenge them that the Indian Act is the root cause of the violence against Indigenous women and girls. And the United Nations bodies, the Inter-American Commission, the courts have told Canada the discrimination is there, get rid of it. 140 years of sex discrimination embedded solidly in the Indian Act. And from Canada cannot even think about addressing this report while it's in violation and the cause of the violence. What if they want to show good faith, saying, okay, we're going to take the report and we're going to do something with it, get rid of the discrimination in the Indian Act. We did a lot of work with the government when they were enacting the last amendment to the Indian Act in 2017. Put so much pressure on that they were forced to put into the Indian Act 2 sections that would almost completely get rid of the ongoing discrimination, but they didn't declare them law. It's sitting there waiting to be declared law, and they could do it tomorrow. Tomorrow, they have cabinet meeting every Tuesday. They have a cabinet meeting, and all they have to do is enact those 2 pieces of legislation. It just requires a cabinet to do it. They could do it tomorrow. And if we are going to see that they are taking this seriously, they can do it tomorrow. And I'm calling on Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet to get busy and at least make sure that we're equal in law. Now cleaning up the inequality that the law has caused, we can't do by tomorrow. Would be nice if we could. But there's a long road ahead. And so what the National Inquiry has put together was key components, they want a national action plan, social and economic disadvantages, damage caused to Indigenous women and girls by the child welfare system, police violence and failure to protect Indigenous women and girls, bias in the justice system, over-criminalization and incarceration of Indigenous women and girls, and support for the families of murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls. Key to this is Canada buying in and Canada doing something about it other than putting the report on the shelves. And I could name you dozens and dozens of reports that have gone this route and have ended up on the shelf. But the key is that they have to acknowledge that they have a role to play here. They had a huge role to play to put us where we are, and they have a role to play to get us back from where we are. And so I call on the government to take it seriously, and tomorrow make me equal to my male counterparts in law. Thank you.
And now it's time to introduce my dear good friend, Grand Chief Stuart Phillips, President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs.
Why, peace nak seal, esquis asiut. I want to begin by acknowledging the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam peoples. And I want to, on behalf of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous courage of all of the people that offered testimony to the National Inquiry. As difficult and challenging as that was, those hundreds and thousands of women knew and understood that if we ever hope to change the reality of the predation, the continued exploitation, the violence against Indigenous women, that they would have to share their stories, as painful as that was. I want to acknowledge the families and the friends and relatives of the Indigenous women that offered testimony for their support. And I would like to also acknowledge all of the organizations and the different groups that supported the women through their very painful journey of recollecting the terrible and horrible abuses that continue to happen to this day. I want us all to pause for a moment and think about those hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous women, our fallen angels, who are no longer with us. I want us to consider their children and their grandchildren that no longer have the comfort and joy of the love of their mothers, their aunties, their grandmothers. Once again, this country has been shamed. Once again, this country that we know as Canada has been confronted with its genocidal history. As we recall, the Truth and Reconciliation Report branded the residential schools as cultural genocide. And now, a few years later, we have the inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls bringing forward another indictment against the country of Canada, that the entire issue represents nothing less than genocide against Indigenous women. Genocide is a word derived from the Latin and Greek words geno, meaning people, and side, meaning death. Genocide is death of a people. And we've witnessed the history of this country bringing forward legislation and policies that have lent itself to this genocidal reality for Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women and girls. So once again, we reach a shameful and disgraceful milestone with the release of this report. And it's our responsibility to hold all governments at all levels to account, to ensure that the recommendations of this report do not gather dust on some bureaucratic shelf in Ottawa, like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which I believe had some 400 recommendations that were amazing. We have to ensure that the recommendations in this report and the recently released report, Red Women Rising, are followed to the letter. And so in that regard, the release of this report represents a new beginning. And now as we gather together as friends, neighbors, allies, we must continue the march forward. We must continue to demonstrate, to march, to hold our candlelight vigils, and not to, for a moment, let up on our work to pressure government to ensure that these recommendations are carried forward, that there are social affordable housing offered to women that are at risk, that there is services, programs and services, women's centers that were all shut down as part of different austerity programs on the part of various governments over the years. All of that must be restored. The supports for Indigenous women and girls must be strengthened. And we can't allow Prime Minister Trudeau to prance in here and offer, some eloquent remarks about good intentions. We need concrete results. We need action. Enough talk. Enough talk, enough consultation. The time for talk is over. Now is the time for action, and it's our responsibility to ensure that happens. I want to acknowledge Melanie Marc, Minister Melanie Marc, for being here. I want to Melanie has always stood with us and marched with us. I want to thank all our allies. I want to thank our dear, beloved elders who have always stood with us. And I just want to take a moment to express my own personal gratitude at wonderful experiences and relationships I have had over the last 20-odd years supporting this movement and marching beside you. It's been such an honor, and I am so deeply humbled to stand here and see such greatness, such courage, which, in my view, this enormous unity of purpose offers hope for my granddaughters. And for that, I thank all of you, and it's been such an honor, and I look forward to tomorrow, next week, next month, as we continue this battle, this fight. Why? Lim lim.
I'd just like to take this opportunity to raise my hands in respect to everybody here and for holding space for those important words to be told. And in closing, I just want to do something highly unusual. So there is a lot of reporters here, and all of these reporters are men. So I have a humble and respectful request. Sorry, my apologies if there's female reporters. Oh, there they are. Thank you for identifying yourself. could you all just have a proper stand, because that wasn't good enough. Your work is so important, and I'm so incredibly grateful for you being here. So back to my first remarks of the men behind the cameras. If you could all just peer around with your real eyes, your natural eyes, take a moment to look away from your artificial eye. I just would like to put a call to action and a request to each of you as well. And for you to go home and to take some time to think about the words that were shared today, and to think about what you as a reporter in Canada, or from wherever you may be, what your role is in perpetuating a lot of this genocide, and what the system of reporting in the media in Canada does, and how much harm comes from the media. As an Indigenous woman, I can tell you that media provides an incredible platform to spread hate and violence and ignorance against Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous women. It's been an incredibly challenging weekend. And I would like each of you to think about what it means for you to do your job in a compassionate and empathetic way, and the ways and the conversations you have in your newsrooms, and about the money and resources that are spent on training each of you about colonization and genocide, how you can serve us better, and how you can share our voices more authentically, so that we're not put in quotations and things aren't maybes. Our stories need to be told, and the truth needs to be told, and you are the ones that hold the power to tell that truth. So I'm asking each of you to take some time to reflect on the work that you do and the conversations that are happening in your newsrooms, and to take some time to look through your websites and your Facebook pages and your Twitter feeds, and to see what your platforms allow to spread, and to ask, why are you not staffing and moderating your social media and taking down that hate? The social media bots that we report to aren't enough. We can't turn our look at the giant platforms and expect them to have our back and to protect us. But each of you are our neighbors. Your children go to school with our children. You are the human connection that we have with the rest of the Canada. So I implore each of you to go back to your newsrooms and to reflect on what each of you can do to stop this genocide. We're going to take a little bit of a break. Lorelei, how much time do you need to get ready? 10 minutes? 10 minutes, 15? 10? 15? 15. 15 minutes. We're going to have the honor of having a performance from Butterflies and Spirits. So please take a moment, stretch your legs, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes.